Parents who adopted a child and then regretted it. What's your story? I'm the adoptee. My adoptive mom had some kidney problems that prevented her from carrying a child. Or so she thought. She was told later that she could have. She told me that had she known then what she knows now, that she wouldn't have adopted me and would have had her own children instead. I was about 12 at the time, and it was devastating. A woman I worked with had been fostering a 13-year-old girl for over 2 years and had started the adoption process. Girl had a history of trouble with her previous fosters, but had been doing very well with them for the whole time they were fostering her. She was seeing a therapist regularly and everything was shaping up to be a clean adoption process. Then she started acting out suddenly, hiding things, blaming my coworker and her husband for separating her from her brother, saying she deserved to live with her real mom. She started getting in trouble at school, being disrespectful to her teachers and that sort of thing. They had several emergency sessions with her therapist, but the girl shut everyone out. The final straw was when she accused my coworker's husband of raping her. There was an investigation and she admitted to lying, but obviously they didn't want to risk having someone who would lie like that in the house. It could have ruined her husband's life. The adoption fell through, and she went back into the foster care system. Her therapist said that it's fairly common for children who come from unstable homes to freak out at the prospect of stability once they have it and begin acting out. Sad situation all around really. I'm an adoptee from the 50s. I was taken in by a foster family who abused me starting in infancy. Physically, verbally, emotionally, and sexually. Both of them. They only adopted me when the state of Mississippi told them that if they did, the abuse would be considered discipline. If they didn't, they could have been charged. So they adopted. The abuse, in every extreme, went on until I left the home at age 15. I never went back, though they never left me alone until they died in 2002 and 2008 respectively. Other members of that family won't deny it all. It happened. I didn't make things up, and had it not occurred, wouldn't be as complicated as I'm today at 65. It goes both ways, people. A neighbor lost her only child in a car accident when child was 17. Adopted a 6-year-old girl, Greta, from a foreign country a few years later when neighbor was 50. Greta had some emotional and behavioral problems which later turned into psychological problems. Neighbor tried various therapists, doctors, drugs, etc. Greta ended up running away the first time at 14, and again a few months later. Her main excuse was that she was trying to get back to the family that neighbor stole her from. Greta really loved using that as a reason to torture neighbor. Greta disappeared at 16 for over a year, and then neighbor is getting a phone call from a hospital 5 states away. Greta had given birth and 7 hours later walked out without the baby, but did leave neighbor's name and contact info. So neighbor is 67 and raising an infant. Greta comes back a year later and basically blackmails neighbor, give her money, or she'll steal the baby like neighbor stole Greta. Greta then disappears for a couple of years, only to leave another baby in another hospital. Both babies were born addicted to drugs as a special added touch. So neighbor is now in her 80s and is raising 2 kids who have behavioral and emotional issues. I had a professor in college have this happen. She and her husband were having trouble getting pregnant and so decided to look into adopting some older kids. They were the perfect couple. Both had good paying, stable jobs, no other kids, willing to take on older kids, etc. They were matched with a set of brothers who had been in the system for a while. They had recently been taken out of a long-term foster home when the boys accused the dad of punishing him by putting hot sauce on his lips. It ended up being a lie, but the damage was done. My professor didn't know that at the time, as the state had only told them they had been taken out BC of abuse. So they adopt the boys, who immediately start having major behavior problems. Through therapy they discovered the boys' both bad reverse attachment disorder worsened by being taken out of their previous home. Both of the boys, middle school age, were acting out so badly they were frequently suspended and nearing expulsion. Around that time my professor got pregnant and soon had a baby boy. Then the brothers started trying to abuse the baby so they could never be alone, not even for 5 minutes. So the parents were constantly monitoring them and they had to sleep under lock and key. It was so bad. My professor and her husband decided to look into moving back to where her parents live in another state, but turned out they had been lied to again, and the boys were not allowed to move to another state under their adoption agreement. So my professor and her husband were stuck with these two boys who hated their adoptive family under extremely difficult and stressful circumstances. Around this time I graduated and lost contact, but I ran into her a couple of years later. Turned out she and her husband had divorced, and she had moved to the other state with her son, and he had stayed and had the two boys. One was eventually court-ordered into a behavioral disability home, so not jail or prison, but like a living facility with regular care and education specifically for those with behavioral disabilities. I was also so saddened by this story. They went into this with pure intentions, looking to provide a loving home to children who need one, only to have all of that destroyed by lies and freaking sucks. We adopted twins, and the experience destroyed our family. Psych admissions, drug use, school expulsions, threats on our lives, starting fires, involvement with gangs, wrecked cars, etc. I could go on. It's the one thing in my life I wish I could undo. We are not alone. I knew one mother in town who deadbolt locked her bedroom door and slept with a knife under her pillow out of fear of her adoptive daughter. Another family had to send their adopted daughter off for a year of residential treatment. Actual foster parent here, haven't adopted. I never regret the kids. I completely regret becoming a foster parent, probably mostly because of the county that I did. It's the bureaucratic bullshit and the courts and workers that don't care about the kids that I can't stand. I've had some really tough kids, and one had to move because we couldn't keep him safe, but I've loved them all regardless of their behaviors. Before adopting me, my parents adopted a baby who they quickly learned was deaf. They didn't feel like they could raise the baby properly, so they worked with the adoption agency to find deaf parents who were thrilled to have her instead. At first I thought it was kind of fucked up that my parents would return a baby, but it really worked out better for everyone in the end. My then wife and I adopted two orphan boys from Russia just before they closed that down. Despite taking every effort to ensure they were boys we could reasonably take care of, one had fairly severe fetal alcohol syndrome and the other was likely affected by the same. The first boy we found parents and the us for after we went to court in Russia and the adoption was final. He second boy we tried with, but the stress of it, we uncovered some underlying issues for my ex, and was later readopted by a family, suited to him in the US. Both boys were brought back to the US, and received their citizenship. I regret never having the sons I wanted, and the stress of all of it was a contributing factor to my ex and I divorcing. I'm glad the $100,000 plus that we spent towards bringing them here ensured them a better life, though I do feel defrauded and see the entire industry as being full of fraud and potential money laundering. The experience was full of regret and was eye-opening. I've told this story a few times, but we adopted a 3-year-old. He had a few behavior issues, which we attributed to trauma, and sought appropriate help. He did well for several years, but when he turned 9 he began displaying dangerous behaviors, hurting animals, hoarding things in his room, making suicidal comments, sexually inappropriate. We ramped up the doc visits and therapy, but he was still admitted to the hospital 3 times before he turned 10. When he was 10, we woke up to our house burning down. He thought it was a party. Spent a few years in a facility, till insurance got sick of paying. They told us we could pay $40K a month to keep him there, or bring him home. We have other younger children and his therapist agreed it wasn't safe. So we refused to pick him up, and now we have a child abuse for abandonment record. Standard. Not my story, but my parents' best friends adopted a son from Russia as a 2-year-old. He is the poster child of fetal alcohol syndrome effects. Violent, learning issues, the shortest temper, the works. His poor, adoptive parents tried everything. They are great parents, and had already raised 3, 2 of their own, and 1 foster kid. This boy gave them every issue. He was violent and disrespectful towards them, towards teachers, toward fellow students. He couldn't be controlled. They cried over him a lot. Legally disowned him at 17. After he stabbed their other kid with a kitchen knife. Not me, but my ex-co-worker. They spent 8 years of paperwork and classes to be able to adopt. When they finally got the money sorted, all the baby clothes, a stroller etc ready, and flew down to the country she was in, the mom had been there the day before and picked up the baby because she had regretted putting it there. My coworker is now considered too old to start a new process and is sadly without any children. Something that is very sad for her. /3. Not mine, but my great uncle and great aunt adopted a girl. She was spoiled sweet and raised in utmost privilege in a mansion with servants, back when such things were possible. She goes to university and is on her final year, so she hosts a graduation party at their house. It cost thousands, with everything being the finest quality. She wasn't even close to graduating. She had barely passed half of her classes in her first year, but she then lied to her parents about it for 2 years, pretending to go to an expensive university while using their money for other things. They found out during the party and felt publicly humiliated, as it was expected. She wasn't disowned or anything, but they almost cut off contact with her. This is just a sad story and only somewhat related. My grandpa's parents had 6 kids before him. He was the 7th, and they didn't want him, so they gave him up for adoption as a baby. He had wonderful, loving parents in a stable home. He was the only child. Then when he was 5, his parents were in a fatal accident, and they both died. My grandpa somehow survived, and instead of being sent to a foster care, he ended up back at his birth parents' house. He went from this amazing, loving home to an abusive one with 6 other children running around. They had no money, so they constantly went hungry. His parents beat him and made sure he knew he wasn't wanted by them. When he was 13, his dad drove him to the Ohio border and told him to get out of the truck. Then he drove off without him. I just have to say that I think the premise, if this question and the responses to stories, is kind of fucked up. I've cared for a lot of abused teenagers and know a lot about foster care / adoption / child development within an abusive and neglectful environment, as that's what I originally planned to do for a career. I hope that anyone who reads these understands that children becoming violent, dangerous and ruining others' lives is the direct result of abuse and neglect, as well as exposure to drugs / alcohol in utero. Most of them probably suffer from RAT, reactive attachment disorder, which is caused by neglect and or abuse in infancy. RAT is usually worst in children taken from orphanages. As you see, a lot of the stories here are about Russian children, both because their orphanages are known for being awful, and Russian children have a horrifyingly high rate of fetal alcohol syndrome. Combined, these two things can destroy a human brain and make them incapable of living a normal life. That being said, I hope everyone reading this realizes that these are the outlier stories and most people who adopt children are very happy. And there are children who were once horrible shortly after being adopted, or even 4 years after being adopted, including those who had radon forms of FARS, who have gotten help through therapy and supportive families, and gone on to get past the pain in their lives. Had a friend who has fostered and attempted to adopt a number of kids. Each story gets more fucked up. One died a few months after they left foster care from spinal meningitis. One little girl whose mom died and was living with her grandparents was fostered for a while and they were looking at adoption. Turned out the grandparents didn't so much want to give their grandchild up for adoption as much as they wanted to adopt children to raise, pay for, the grandchild. They insisted on visiting whenever they wanted. They wanted her to stay with them on holidays and birthdays and random weekends. The kid was very damaged. They started going to a therapist, and as all this was going on they had their own child and the foster child acted up all the time around the baby. She would throw tantrums and scream uncontrollably in public. Turned out the grandparents used to lock her in her room, and when the caseworker discovered it, the child was interviewed by a psychologist and they discovered that the child had been sexually abused and had major trauma and manifesting issues. They wanted my friend to commit to 5-day-a-week therapy sessions and the grandparents were being investigated for their role in the abuse. By this time his wife was afraid of the kid and she was caught inappropriately touching the baby. Long story short, they were able to disentangle themselves from the situation. Just super sad all around. Lastly, they fostered a 13-year-old girl who would always strip down and leave doors open and walk around nude after being told repeatedly to close doors when she showered and cover up. She got upset at my friend and accused him of sexually abusing her. After an investigation, he was totally cleared of any wrongdoing. It was discovered that their stepdad was abusing her for years. The caseworker asked him when they could bring her back to his home, and he said, "You've got to be kidding me." That cured him from wanting to foster any more kids. Almost ruined his life and career. It wasn't me, but my neighbors, when I was about 10 years old, adopted a girl that was my age. They already had 3 other adopted children, and one that was actually their own. This poor girl was 10 years old, and they changed her name from something that she went by her whole life. She had a whole slew of issues, but what topped it off was when she started developing a crush on one of her adopted brothers. The mother and the son caught the adopted daughter watching him sleep multiple times, and there was a few times where she would hold him down and tickle him inappropriately. He was only 8 years old. I think the cherry on the cake was when the mom found a journal the girl had been keeping, saying how much she was in love with that little boy and things she wanted to do to him. They sent her back to her foster home after only a few months of her living with them. My brother was one of the last Native American kids taken from his family and given to a white family. His mom was very clearly below 100 IQ and had what was described as elephant man's disease, but on the inside. His dad grew up in a sanatorium that was exposed by Geraldo when he was still a journalist. Plot twist: they didn't tell my parents any of this when we adopted him around 1980. About 10 years with us, he wants to see his biological family. We realized that this adoption was technically illegal. Federal laws about white people legally adopting Native American kids. He lived with his biological parents for a while, then us again, then a halfway home for kids with his particular problems. Thumbs down, would not adopt again.